sent you. So in the JPPM piece, you wrote that simply measuring the extent of racial disparity has proved needlessly challenging.
Mhm.
So this is sort of a two-part question, and Dr. Grier, I wanted to start with you. How has race been, as you noted in the other article, overlooked as an icon in the marketplace, or an overlooked icon in the marketplace?
I think there's a couple of ways to think about that. One is the way race has been studied. So, for example, we have often thought in the literature, a lot of it talks about race as this individual difference variable that helps to show differences between groups. And that's important because people may respond differently to ads that feature people who look like them, for example. However, that research doesn't really incorporate the reality of race and racism and the way people experience race in the marketplace. It doesn't necessarily incorporate either the personal and individual racism, interpersonal racism that people may face, nor does it incorporate structural racism, which are the systems and structures and patterns that are mutually reinforcing and that have an effect on the way people live, and in this case, people's health or people's lifestyles, or their financial ability. So that becomes really important to think about race beyond this narrow conceptualization as an individual difference variable. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, David.
Well, let me piggyback on that a little bit. So the another component that I would mention here that can make race difficult to study, and Sonya really knows more about this than I do, but from a data gathering perspective, a lot of times what we have is sort of a philosophical issue where there are sometimes the basic assumptions that some researchers make is that whatever you might learn by measuring or capturing race, you could learn by some other presumably more fundamental variable. So income or education, et cetera, right? So people simply choose not to measure it because they think they could get more or better information from some other variable that they think is more fundamentally relevant. And so that's a philosophical challenge. And then sort of based on that, a lot of times, particularly in the kind of work that Sonya does, she's trying to collect data from public entities. And there are public entities that have effectively refused to collect data on race for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that some of our governing bodies simply don't want to know, right? They don't want to measure racial disparities because once you know there's a problem, then you are somewhat duty bound to at least act like you're trying to fix it. We've seen the same with COVID. So race is not the only place where this happens, right? This happens with a variety of social problems. There are folks who are committed to saying there's nothing to see here, and so we're not looking.
Let's kind of dive in more about, being able to use data, to use marketing scholarship and use it in this case in particular with the pandemic, particularly as it relates to healthcare. There are certainly many ways the pandemic is affecting people, but specifically with the healthcare piece. And I know you mentioned, even customer experience in healthcare, certainly. So can you dive into how marketing scholarship, how data can be better used then to fix these disparities?
If you think about it, one of our key sort of tools that we use is place and accessibility. And for example, one of the things during COVID, I read an example about drive-through testing in New Orleans. Back in April, they had all these drive-through testing centers. Well, when you look at the data showed that the hot spots were in predominantly African-American areas where people didn't have the same amount of cars. And so that meant drive-through testing wasn't going to help if you didn't have a car. And therefore, that kind of accessibility, location, information data is used to inform the types of interventions. Once they discovered that, they were able to send in a mobile testing unit. But without that data, that meant during that period when they had all this drive-through testing, there were lots of people who were not able to be tested and who may have continued to spread the disease because they didn't know. And it may not have been because they didn't want to be tested. It may have been because testing was not accessible to them. And that's a key core marketing component.
And let me add to that as well. So one of the things that I think is so critical about the work that she and I do, but the work that a number of scholars do, particularly who fall under the umbrella of the Race in the Marketplace network. The marketplace is not just a stage on which a variety of things play out, whether it's about race or it's about gender or about social class or what have you. The marketplace is a social actor that, on the one hand, can perpetuate these systems of oppression, and on the other hand, can challenge them, sometimes both at the same time, sometimes in ways where we can't discern whether it's perpetuating or challenging right now. Sometimes we have to let history unfold to give us the answer to those things. But what's so critical about kind of this moment is that I think the marketplace has become a central actor in this drama around race and COVID. So, we've been told for 40 years now that, our system of governance that includes a capitalist economic system with the kind of government that we have was the best of all possible worlds. And at the moment, not only has it not delivered healthcare very well, even to people who could afford it, much less people who can't. It has not delivered toilet paper very well, which is kind of like the one thing that it said it should be able to do, right? They could not get you toilet paper to your home when you needed some. And so what that says to me as a scholar is that we should be interrogating that, right? That should no longer simply be a piece of the background that we just assume away. We should bring the role of the marketplace to the fore as an object of study, as an object of investigation. How is its functioning contributing to racial oppression and other kinds of oppression? How is it contributing to counter-hegemonic activity, right? Where people are issuing these challenges to these systems of oppression. How is it operating there?
Well, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about the economic piece of it then too. Not that healthcare isn't a huge part of the economy, certainly, but people of color have been more affected by the economic impact of sheltering in place as well. So, a variety of reasons for this, but what are some of the most pressing areas of policy research that you think can be undertaken to preventing this in the future, or maybe stifling a little bit now so it doesn't continue as the pandemic continues?
One area that I think, and we only touch on very briefly, but it's something I've been thinking a lot about, is caregiving. For example, when you look at the work, there's very little, I can't actually think of one article in marketing about caregiving. And that is something that is very prevalent in the US and around the world. It's something that's very gendered and very raced. And it also has severe implications for this COVID pandemic that we see today. We see that even nursing homes are segregated, that people of color tend to live in more multi-generational households. So this whole notion of protect the elderly, keep them separate, all these shelter in place notions that we have and would like to undertake can't necessarily be done by everyone in the same way. And therefore they might need different types of interventions. But if we don't have any research around that, then no one even thinks about it as an issue, much less begins to collect the data or discuss how we might develop interventions to address it.
Race and ethnicity are a part of every subject, right? And I think that's one of the things we want to get across, is that it's not necessarily a separate thing that needs to be studied, though that sometimes is the case, right? But it is also part and parcel to the functioning of a variety of systems that on the surface appear as if they are non-racial, that they have no race or ethnicity in them. And part of our call is to take those things that appear as if they are invisible and bring them to the fore, right? And so, whether it is healthcare, we have disparities, but even much deeper than that, right? The basic functioning of having a capitalist model of healthcare delivery has implications for race, right? Has implications for gender, has implications for ethnicity. And part of our job as scholars is to bring those things to the fore. And even if that's not what you study, it's to not be conclusion selective at the outset and say that those things don't matter. Even if it is to say a limitation is that my study does not address this set of issues. That might be something that someone else needs to study. That's okay too. Everybody doesn't need to study everything. But we are still at this point in many ways, still fighting this sort of first principles battle with respect to race and ethnicity. That is, it is worthy of study, not just as a distinct subfield, but as part and parcel of everything that we are doing, whether it's marketing, economics, poli-sci, whatever it is, it's part of it.
Yeah, and I would add on to what David says, the fact that these things are mutually reinforcing across different sectors and domains. I mean, that's one of the areas that RIM really has seized upon, is this notion that it's not just the marketplace in terms of the commercial outlets that we see. There's also health and education and art and entertainment that all have the same types of institutional and structural racism in them that has an impact on people's everyday lives. Because I'm not just an academic, you know, I might also go out to the movies and want to see, you know, certain types of stories. I might also want to go out at night to the nightclub. I might, you know, all these different things. I want to get health care. All of these pieces of my life come together. And in marketing, that's what attracted me to marketing, is this whole notion that you can really study anything, because everything to me is marketing.
Right.
You know, that it's a part and parcel across all these domains. So if we limit it to thinking about, you know, race in this really narrow way, then we limit people to being these unidimensional beings that they are not.
The amount of work that still needs to be done, of course, across the board, but then also within marketing research as well, is of course massive. And scholar, whether it's within marketing or, you know, academia, whatever, it's not known to be the fastest changing. And when there are, you know, policies that need to be enacted immediately, or maybe companies that could use a little bit of this sort of research help, politicians who could use this research help now, how can scholars help with that? When, you know, is it looking back at their previous research, or is it just saying, hey, make sure you're including this in your data when you're taking a look at things, or make sure when you start to gather new data, you're including this? You know, what's the change now, without being like, okay, we'll get there, we're trying, it's going to be however many years?
I think everything you said is really important, that it's not one or the other. I would say that a first step, Dave mentioned this first principle, is awareness and acceptance. I mean, there's still not as much emphasis on race. I mean, at this present moment, we have a lot of emphasis on race. I hope it lasts, because it provides an opportunity for people to expand the way they think about topics. I don't know, you were going to say something, David.
That's good. Go, you got it. Roll with it.
No, I mean,
Okay.
I see it as an opportunity. For example, there's an increased emphasis on intersectionality, cross disciplines, but in marketing as well. We could encourage, just by asking the questions, the collection of certain types of data. We could partner with nonprofit, public, or private organizations, so that government agencies who don't have deep segmentation information to understand where the hotspots are, or don't have the geofencing capabilities and data, would be able to do that through these partnerships. We see that lots of research now gets done through these multi-sector, multi-partner types of partnerships, and that presents a big opportunity. I think about the data in obesity. That's where a lot of my work has been. And in another article in JPPM, we talk about the fact that government actors said they didn't have the data to compete with companies. That, for example, data on obesity was often presented by race, by gender, by income, but not their intersections. So how do we then start to understand those intersections, which are really important? There are significant differences by race, gender, and class in terms of obesity rates and the influences upon obesity. So that's something that market researchers could actually help to advocate for and help to create and develop as we move forward with this research. But that has to come from the acceptance that this is an important area of study. I mean, I will say I left marketing. I went to a postdoc program with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health and Society Scholars because I was tired of trying to spend half of my paper to say why race was important. When you go in health, you know, there might be a different set of issues, but when health, the papers are shorter and it starts out with the premise that race is important to health. I didn't have to spend, you know, 5 pages to say, we really need to study this because this is important. And even though we're a minority of the population, these are issues that should be of concern.
It's settled law. It's settled. Like, we know it's a big problem, and everything should sort of flow from that, kind of as a premise. The one thing I will add to that, and it really is about kind of the way you phrased this, Sarah, which this is not a critique of the way you phrased it. I think it's common. There is this notion that there's so much work to be done. You know, there's a massive amount that we need to know but don't know. That's absolutely true, and I would argue that it is true for every discipline in the field, right? Like that is a fundamental condition of academic life. And so there's a way at times that particular premise, though true, can often be marshaled in a way to demotivate scholarship in an area that really needs it. Like, of course, there's much work to be done. There's a whole lot we don't know, but I presume that's why anyone gets into any academic discipline in the first place, right? Like, we are here to answer questions. The most immediate thing, to echo Sonya, that needs to be done is structuring research questions and data sets that even begin to allow us to explore, right? That's where we still are, unfortunately, at this moment. And like, you know, if we could clear that hurdle, we might actually be able to do something. We got a lot of smart people. We got a lot of people of goodwill. We got a lot of people who are interested in these issues. You know, so if we can just tackle this first principle thing, we might actually be able to do some pretty good work.
Right, and I think I would add to that too, the fact that marketing is an interdisciplinary field. Marketing and consumer research have always borrowed from other disciplines and fields. There are many fields that do lots of great work related to race that would be relevant to us. In fact, we also use that as one of the motivating factors for starting RIM, is that we saw the work that we should be doing being done in other fields. And so there's this opportunity, as marketing and consumer research has always done, to pull from these different disciplines the understandings that would help to inform our own research so we can develop that research that helps to inform policy.
Absolutely. And then what's cool about marketing, specifically marketing and consumer research, which I consider to be the same discipline, I know others would disagree, and that's all right. But what's cool about the two of them is that they paint a conception of consumers and marketplace actors that is not naive. And that is often the thing that is missing from these other disciplines. Whether they're on the left or the right politically, they often make many of the same super naive assumptions about the way markets work, about what consumers do. And that really is what we bring to the table, even when we are borrowing their theories, is being able to manipulate them in a way and in a setting in a way that brings some sophistication to the table. And too often, I think we either don't realize or we back away from that. We should never cower our heads in a room full of economists. You know, I respect what they do and I respect their work, but far too often you're working on a set of assumptions about what people do that are preposterously naive. And that is not to belittle any of the work that's done, but it is to say that we often bring some really quality complementary perspectives and sometimes deeply oppositional perspectives to the same set of issues. And that's how knowledge grows.
Right. You both touched on something that I think is so interesting, which is really the intersectionality of marketing with so many other things, whether it's with other pieces of academia, whether it's with other fields, whether it's, Dr. Grier, you mentioned earlier, like, it includes like entertainment and healthcare. And I mean, it can touch everything. One of the things I really want to hit on, because so much of the AMA's audience, the marketing news audience, is practitioners, is what practitioners then can do with academics a little bit more, and the research that everyone's doing to put these changes so that we aren't seeing the inequities because of COVID, because of the economy, because of everything else, into practice as practitioners. How can we cross those two things a little bit better?
I'll at least lead off, because honestly, Sonya's done more of that than I have. I'm working with a small consortium of retailers with a sociologist doing work specifically on racial inequality, particularly racial bias and exclusionary treatment at retail. So these are folks who want to understand something about how do we craft store policy from everything around hiring all the way through merchandising, right? Like all of that stuff, like who we hire, what they say, how products are positioned in the store. They're trying to get all of that right. Because even if it's just superficial, they recognize that the world is changing, and this was going on before the current moment. They recognize that the world is changing, and they got to get it right. If they're trying to compete, that's a dimension on which they can compete, and they're trying to get it right. And so, I think that sometimes we mystify these relationships in a way that they don't really need to be. So, sometimes this is like, and listen, this was not my initiative. This was an initiative of this small consortium. They reached out, they made those connections, and, a set of academics responded to them. And, we've had a great working relationship, looking at everything from trying to collect data to measure what needs to be measured, all the way through kind of how they do some of their product branding and how they lay out their stores. So, in a way, it's like, it's not that complicated. The work is complicated, but the process by which we begin to connect with each other is not that complicated. It's the way you connect with anybody.
Right, and those connections, I think, are really necessary to help inform policy research. That if you could start the process with those connections in mind, even if it's a new project that you're doing by yourself. Dave's working with a consortium, but if you start it with, I want to have an impact on what the practice of a certain industry, or the practice of certain types of companies in a certain industry, then beginning with that in mind and making those connections at the start, trying to identify ways that you might share data, that you might be able to use some of their data, and then you can help inform the development of their policy. Mm-hmm. We've seen a lot in the marketplace, most recently, with everyone standing in solidarity with Black Lives Matters and saying what they're going to do. Well, they're going to need third parties, if they really want to have transparency, to be able to monitor and evaluate if they are really doing what they're doing. Mm-hmm. That's a perfect role for some partnerships between consumer researchers and marketing researchers. Mm-hmm. To be able to step right in with practitioners and to say, let me help you evaluate and monitor all these things that you said that you're going to do along with, in order to help create racial and social justice.
And to its credit, hopefully the check is in the mail, but I will say this, the American Marketing Association has actually been pretty good at that sort of thing, trying to create some of those connections in different ways at different times. And that's a role, I think that's a role for this kind of organization as well.
And you highlight the role of institutions. I think across the board, we have to think about journals, and do they have reviewers who understand this type of work? Mm-hmm. We think about, for example, transformative consumer research. TCR has also been taking the lead in terms of creating connections with nonprofits to address social issues. So bringing together all of these sort of institutional pieces will also be necessary, because if you have lots of people who submit articles and you have reviewers who don't understand or don't accept or who don't think this is important, then that research doesn't go anywhere.
Was there anything else that you guys wanted to mention that I didn't bring up, but just anything else? Kind of the floor is yours right now.
I think this is a real potentially transformative opportunity and time, and I hope that we can take it to really move the field forward so that we can be at the forefront of helping to inform policy relevant and corporate relevant and societally relevant research.
You know what? Well, let's leave it with that. That's a great way to wrap.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, that was a perfect wrap.